everyone, and welcome back to the Wisdom by Harry YouTube channel. My name is Harry.
And I'm Mary.
We're so excited for you to be here with us today.
Yeah, for another fascinating episode.
Today, we're diving into something really cool.
Oh, yeah.
Using podcast conversations to learn English.
Yeah.
You know, it's amazing how much you can pick up just by listening to native speakers chat.
It's true. Podcasts are like a secret weapon for language learners.
Oh, tell me more.
You get exposed to like authentic English, you know, different accents, slang, idioms.
Yeah.
It's gold mine.
I love that.
It is.
That's what we're going to explore today.
Yeah.
We've got a fascinating episode of Podcast Speak English lined up, hosted by Marco and Catherine.
Yes. And this particular episode focuses on dealing with negative emotions and how to talk about them in English.
Ooh.
I think we can all relate to that, right?
Oh, for sure.
Life throws curveballs.
Yeah.
And, you know, sometimes you just need the right words to express how you feel.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what kind of gems did Marco and Catherine have to offer?
Well, they used a bunch of interesting phrases that you might not find in a textbook.
Well,
For example, to describe bad moods, they talked about feeling down and grouchy.
grouchy.
Grouchy,
That's a great one.
right?
It's so much more descriptive than just saying like sad or upset.
Uh-huh.
You instantly get that image of someone who's grumpy and irritable.
Right. It's like a more vivid way to paint a picture of your mood.
I love that.
And you know what helps me remember it?
What?
Thinking of Oscar the Grouch from Sesame Street.
Oh, yeah.
Always grumpy, always complaining.
Always grouchy.
He is.
Perfect. I won't forget that one now.
Good.
So besides grouchy, what other phrases did they use for negative emotions?
Well, they also talked about feeling stressed out and on edge.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that they even discussed how to describe situations that cause those feelings.
Okay.
Like they use the word nerve-wracking to talk about things that make you anxious.
Yeah, nerve-wracking is a good one. It's like your nerves are literally being like stretched and pulled.
They are.
Have you ever felt that way?
Oh, badly. Public speaking always gets my nerves going.
Oh, yeah.
What about you?
What kind of situations make me feel nerve-wracked?
Yeah.
Anything involving heights. Just thinking about standing on a high ledge makes me feel on edge.
I can relate to that.
Yeah.
And that's a good point you bring up on edge. It's like a heightened state of stress where you're easily irritated or angered.
Right, so you've got grouchy, stressed out, on edge.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many different ways there are to describe negative emotions in English.
It is.
It's like having a whole palette of colors to express yourself.
Exactly. And what I love about this podcast is that it helps you understand not just the meaning of these words, but also their appropriate usage in a real conversation.
Yeah,
That's key to sounding natural.
totally.
Yeah.
But it's not just about expressing negative emotions,
Yeah.
right? They also talked about ways to cope with them.
Absolutely. And that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, tell me more. What kind of coping mechanisms did they discuss?
Well, they touched on phrases like losing your temper, brushing someone off, and then on the flip side, cheering someone up.
Oh yeah, I definitely know that, losing my temper feeling. It's so frustrating, but
Exactly. It's that moment when you just can't hold back the anger anymore.
yeah.
But did you notice how Marco and Catherine also talked about ways to avoid getting to that point?
I'm curious, what did they suggest?
Well, they talked about brushing someone off as a way to deal with anger.
Okay.
Like when you just need some space and don't want to engage.
Yeah, sometimes you just need to step away and cool down before you say something you'll regret.
Right.
But I'm sure brushing someone off can be misinterpreted, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Like, how do you...
It's all about the context and how you do it.
Yeah.
Marco gave a pretty relatable example about how he brushed off his friend who wanted to go to the movies. But you could hear in his tone that it wasn't meant to be hurtful.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how much tone of voice can influence the meaning of a phrase.
It's true. And that's one of the biggest benefits of learning English through podcasts.
Yeah.
You get to hear how these phrases are used in different situations and with different inflections.
Yeah.
It really helps you develop a more intuitive understanding of the language.
So true. Okay, I'm really intrigued by this episode.
Yeah.
What else did you cover?
Well, they went on to talk about ways to cheer someone up,
Okay.
which of course is the opposite of feeling down.
Right.
And this is where I think we can all learn a thing or two.
Yeah.
They shared some of their own personal remedies for dealing with negativity.
Ooh. Like, ooh. I'm always looking for new ways to boost my mood.
Well, Marco mentioned that he finds going shopping therapeutic.
Okay.
Not necessarily about buying things, but more about being out and about, browsing, maybe treating himself to something small.
Retail therapy. I
Yeah.
totally get that. What about Catherine? What's her go-to mood booster?
Catherine is more of an organizer.
Okay.
She said that when she's stressed, she likes to tidy up and organize things.
Interesting. It's like putting your physical space in order to calm your mind.
Right.
I like that.
Me too. And you know what's fascinating is that they even discuss this idiom, you are something else. It's a phrase that can be either positive or negative depending on the tone of voice.
That's so true. It's all about the delivery. You could say it with admiration or with utter disbelief.
Right. And that's what makes spoken English so dynamic and honestly a little bit challenging. You have to pay attention to all those subtle cues to really understand the meaning.
Absolutely. Like a puzzle.
It is.
Figuring out all the nuances and hidden meanings.
It is, but that's also what makes it so rewarding, right? The
Yeah.
more you learn, the more you realize how much depth and complexity there is to the language.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
So we've covered a lot of ground already, but it seems like there's even more to uncover in this episode.
Yeah.
What else can you tell me?
Well, there's this one part where Marco and Catherine discuss something quite insightful.
Okay.
The concept of remedies.
Remedies. What do you mean by that?
They were talking about specific things you can do to combat negative emotions.
Okay.
It's like having a toolkit for dealing with bad moods.
I love that.
Yeah.
So it's not just about identifying the feeling, but also having actionable strategies to shift your mindset.
Exactly. And that's what I find so empowering about learning English through podcasts like this. It's not just about vocabulary and grammar. It's about gaining practical tools for navigating real-life situations.
That's such a good point. It's like a crash course in emotional intelligence, all wrapped up in a casual conversation.
Right.
Right.
And it reminds me of something else they touched upon, the fact that different people express their emotions in different ways.
Yeah.
Some are more vocal, while others are more reserved.
Yeah, that's so true.
Uh-huh.
And I imagine that can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings, especially when you're interacting with people from different cultures.
Oh, absolutely. What might be considered rude or aggressive in one culture might be perfectly normal in another.
Yeah.
It's all about being aware of those cultural nuances and adapting your communication style accordingly.
It's like learning a whole new set of social cues along with the language itself.
Exactly. And that's why I think this podcast is so valuable. It's not just teaching you English, it's giving you a glimpse into the culture and how people communicate in real life situations.
I'm completely hooked.
Yeah.
What else did Marco and Catherine discuss?
Well, they talked about a lot of other interesting things like...
This is reminding me of that time I tried to explain how I was feeling to a friend, and I just couldn't find the right words. It was so frustrating.
I've been there too. Sometimes you just wish you had a bigger vocabulary to articulate those subtle shades of emotion.
Exactly. Like, how do you explain that feeling of being on edge without sounding like you're about to explode?
Right. It's a tricky one. But that's why listening to these podcast conversations is so helpful. You pick up on all those little expressions that native speakers use naturally.
It's like absorbing the language by osmosis.
Yeah.
You start to notice patterns and develop an ear for what sounds right.
Absolutely. Remember those phrases we talked about earlier? Stressed out, nerve-wracking, on edge?
Yeah.
Marco and Catherine actually gave some great examples of how to use them in different situations.
Ooh, I'd love to hear some of those examples. It's one thing to know the meaning of a word, but it's another thing to actually use it in a conversation.
Totally. So, for instance, they talked about how being a doctor can be incredibly nerve-wracking. Think about it. You're dealing with people's health making life or death decisions. That's a lot of pressure.
No kidding. It takes a special kind of person to handle that kind of stress day in and day out.
Right. And they also mentioned how skydiving was a nerve-wracking experience. Can you imagine that feeling of jumping out of a plane, free-falling through the air?
I get chills just thinking about it. It'd be exhilarating and terrifying at the same time.
Definitely. And then there was this example about a soccer match between Brazil and Italy. Imagine the tension in those final moments, the feeling that either team could win.
Oh man, I can practically feel the energy. It must have been so nerve-wracking for the players and the fans.
Exactly. See how those real-life examples make the phrases come alive?
Oh yeah.
You can almost feel the emotions they're describing.
Totally. It's like those words are no longer just abstract concepts. They're connected to real experiences and feelings.
Speaking of relatable experiences, let's talk about brushing someone off. I think we've all been on both sides of that one at some point.
Oh yeah, for sure. Sometimes you're the one doing the brushing and sometimes you're the one getting brushed off. It's not always fun, but it's definitely part of life.
It is. And Marco and Catherine actually shared a funny example of this. Do you remember when Marco's friend asked him to go see a movie and he just brushed him off with a silly excuse?
Uh-huh. Yeah, that was classic. It's amazing how creative we can get with our excuses when we're trying to avoid something.
It's true. Oh, I have to wash my hair tonight. My goldfish needs a pedicure. We've all been there.
But I think it's important to remember that sometimes people brush others off because they're dealing with their own stuff. It might not be personal.
That's a really good point. Maybe they're feeling stressed, angry, or just need some space to process their emotions.
Exactly. It's a good reminder to have compassion and try not to take things personally.
Absolutely. And speaking of compassion, let's talk about cheering someone up. Marco and Catherine actually shared some of their own go-to remedies for feeling better when they're down.
Ooh. I'm always up for learning new mood-boosting techniques. What did they suggest?
Well, Marco mentioned that he likes to go shopping to clear his head. It's not necessarily about buying things, but more about the experience of being out and about browsing and maybe treating himself to something small.
Retail therapy. I get that. Sometimes just getting out of the house and changing your environment can make a big difference.
Right, and Catherine is more of an organizer. She finds comfort in tidying up and putting things in order.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's almost like organizing your physical space helps to organize your mental space.
Exactly. It's about finding those little rituals that bring a sense of calm and control when things feel chaotic.
So we've got retail therapy for Marco and organized serenity for Catherine. I wonder what other cheering up strategies are out there.
That's a good question. I think it would be interesting to hear what our listeners do to boost their moods.
Totally. Maybe we could have a little cheering up challenge in the comments section. Everyone can share their favorite mood-boosting activity.
That's a great idea. It would be
Yeah.
fun to see what everyone comes up with.
Okay, so we've talked about nerve-wracking situations, brushing people off, and cheering ourselves up. What else stuck out to you from this episode?
Well, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. Remember that phrase, you are something else?
Yeah.
It's such a versatile expression, but it can be tricky to interpret.
Yeah, I remember them using it in a playful way, but I can definitely see how it could have a more negative connotation depending on the context.
Exactly. Like if someone says it with a sarcastic or angry tone, it could be a way of expressing disapproval or even disgust.
It's all about paying attention to the tone of voice in the situation. That's where the real learning happens, picking up on those subtle cues that give language its depth and richness.
And that's why listening to podcasts can be so valuable. You get to hear how native speakers use these phrases in different contexts, and you start to develop an intuitive understanding of how they work.
It's like you're training your ear to become a language detective.
I love that analogy.
You're constantly analyzing the clues and piecing together the puzzle of meaning.
And the best part is it doesn't feel like work. It's just like listening to an interesting conversation.
Exactly. It's a fun and engaging way to immerse yourself in the language and culture.
So tell me, what are some of your personal pet peeves? You know, those little things that make you lose your temper?
Let me think. I think one of my biggest pet peeves is people chewing with their mouths open. It drives me absolutely crazy.
Oh, I feel you on that one. It's like nails on a chalkboard.
Exactly. It's amazing how something so seemingly minor can trigger such a strong reaction. But that just goes to show how deeply connected we are to our senses and how they influence our emotions.
It's true. And it makes you wonder how you would describe those feelings in another language. Like, how would you say, it drives me crazy in a way that truly captures the intensity of the feeling?
That's a good point. I guess it's all about finding those equivalent expressions that convey the same emotional weight.
Right. And that's another reason why listening to podcasts can be so beneficial for language learners. You get to hear how native speakers express those everyday frustrations and annoyances.
It's like getting a crash course in the emotional landscape of a language.
Right.
You learn not just the words, but also the cultural context behind them.
Absolutely. And it's not just about negative emotions either. You can also learn how to express joy, excitement, surprise, and all those other wonderful feelings that make up the human experience.
It's like you're expanding your emotional vocabulary along with your linguistic vocabulary.
Exactly. And that's what makes language learning so fascinating. It's a journey of self-discovery as much as it is about communication.
I couldn't agree more. This whole conversation has really opened my eyes to the power of podcasts as a language learning tool.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's such a simple yet effective way to immerse yourself in the language and culture. And the best part is it's completely accessible to anyone with an internet connection.
And you can do it anywhere, anytime. While you're commuting, exercising, cooking dinner. It's like sneaking in a language lesson without even realizing it.
Exactly. And as we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge.
Ooh, I love a good challenge. What is it?
I challenge you to find a podcast that truly interests you. It could be about anything and commit to listening to it regularly.
Great idea. It could be about news, sports, comedy, true crime, history, science, whatever you're passionate about.
Exactly. The key is to find something that you genuinely enjoy listening to. And as you listen, pay attention to the language they're using. Notice the phrases they repeat, the idioms they use, the way they structure their sentences.
And don't be afraid to look up words you don't understand. You'll be surprised how quickly your vocabulary expands just by listening and being curious.
Absolutely. And most importantly, have fun with it. Learning a language should be an enjoyable experience, not a chore.
Well said. So to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to embrace the world of podcasts and discover the incredible learning opportunities they offer.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of language learning through podcast conversations. We hope you learned something new today.
And we'll be back soon with more fascinating topics to explore. Until then, keep those ears open and those minds engaged.
Happy listening.